Hi all, this is your Professor Ian. This is a lecture on poetry. So this is just a general introduction to poetry. Um, so let's get started. Poetry. How do we define poetry? What is poetry? Well, it's a very broad term, poetry, but there's some things we can say. Poetry is not prose. Poetry is not the same, a poem is not the same as a story, although we do have prose poetry, which blurs these lines. So even this isn't a set definition. Prose is the ordinary language that people speak or write in, right? So when I have a conversation with somebody or I write a message, we could call that prose. Or if I write a story, we could call that prose. However, some prose, especially fictional, is very poetic. If you're a fan of Michael Ondaatje or that kind of writing, you'll know that there's certainly is a blurred line even there. Poetry is generally a form of literary expression that captures intense experiences or creative perceptions around of the world in unusual language. But that sounds really kind of high in, a little bit pretentious, right? Literary expression. I've heard tons of poetry that uses the language of everyday speech and vulgarity and slang to really try to create meaning. So I like this definition, but it's also a little stuffy, right? So another way I like to think about it is that poetry sits between theater, right? If you're a fan of theater, and prose. So written language that's a little bit stuffier. It's not dependent on the immediacy of theater. If you're a theater fan, you'll know that one of the biggest impacts of theater is being in a room with other people, watching something happen live before your eyes, right? But reading a poem is meant to be an experience in a similar way. It's meant to evoke an immediate response in a different way than prose. Prose is generally more staid and, doesn't have to be clinical, but it's definitely meant to, it's used to explore more intellectual ideas using plain language. Poetry is all about creating new connections between things and giving that experience to the reader. A poem is meant to be an object of art in many instances, right? Something you could experience and have an emotional and oftentimes intellectual reaction to as you're reading and as you're reflecting on it, right? We don't usually use poetry to try to get across super complex philosophical theories, right? That's what prose is good for. Poetry can really impact us, though, and get the emotions and such across. So anyways, those are some ideas. We'll return to these throughout the semester. How do we define poetry? What does it mean for us? There's a million definitions, and these are just some ideas. So in order to help us define this, I'm going to go through a poem and talk about some different ways to read poetry. This will give you an idea about how I approach it, perhaps. So I'm going to talk about the poem Metaphors by Sylvia Plath. This is a favorite poem of mine. You might have encountered it before. Let me just read it out and then we'll start going through it. So, metaphors. I'm a riddle in 9 syllables, an elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. Oh, red fruit, ivory, fine timber, this loaf's big with its yeasty rising. Money's new minted in this fat purse. I'm a means, a stage, a cowing calf. I've eaten a bag of green apples. Boarded the train, there's no getting off. Fun poem, right? So anyways, let's see how we can take this apart together. I'm going to introduce this acronym I like to use, like to think about when I'm talking about textual analysis. It's poetry, short stories, whatever kind of poem, or whatever kind of text, even prose text. It doesn't matter. This is a good step-by-step way to think about it. I like the acronym EAT. I love to eat, so why not? EAT, E for explicate, A for analyze, T for theorize. So explicate just means explain the words on the page. Oftentimes, especially with poetry, people want to jump to meaning right away without really looking at the actual words on the page. Poetry is all about, really fine attention to detail in specific words, punctuation marks. Every little thing can count in poetry, right? So it's important for us as readers of poetry to really explicate and explain what's on the page. From there, we start analyzing. Okay, I see this pattern in the words, right? I see a lot of words about winter, let's say, for example. What does that mean? How can I analyze that? And you start putting together theories, right? The last part. So you start analyzing, looking for patterns, looking for what they mean, and then theorizing about what that means. So it's just a a short acronym I like to use to remind myself to pause and take a moment with the poem and look what's actually on the page. To get more in depth, I like the acronym WRITER with 2 W's, and that stands for who, what, rhythm and rhyme, imagery, tone, effect, and response. This is just one way of going through a poem, and it's one I like. Again, it forces you to stop and consider a lot of the things that are happening instead of just jumping in and trying to make meaning without looking at the actual words on the page. Okay, so let's start with who. Who is speaking in this poem, right? We have a speaker, a voice that's talking to the reader, right? The speaker is not necessarily the poet, so Sylvia Plath, if you know anything about her, is not necessarily the same person as the I in this poem, right? We need to make that distinction. The speaker in a poem is not necessarily the author, and in fact, we can't really think of the speaker in a poem the same as the speaker, right? That leads us down some dangerous analytical paths. We want to impose biographical information on our reading of a text, which gets pretty messy, right? Because the I could be anything in this, as we'll see as we unpack it. And then we need to ask, is there an auditor? An auditor is the audience to whom the I is speaking, right? Is there a specific auditor in this poem? I don't see one. The speaker is speaking to us, the reader. Sometimes in a poem, you'll have two people engaged in a dialogue, and that would be the auditor of the poem, right? In this one, the auditor is us, the people reading the poem. So who is the speaker? Well, we don't know, right? In fact, we're told, I am a riddle in 9 syllables. So the whole poem is a kind of riddle where we're unpacking who the I is, okay? And that's it for my first video. I'm going to pick this up in my second video, part 2. This way you can digest these ideas in smaller chunks. Okay, thank you very much.